using ICE, using the FBI, the DEA, whatever agencies we have available. But if they're located in a third country, like operating out of Mexico, we can now share that information with our Mexican partners. It's their country, and they can action that item because it poses a threat to both of our countries. And we would hope now that we can get more cooperation from them on that front.
You told reporters in Saudi Arabia that there hasn't been regularized contact with the Russians in 3.5 years. How much ground was lost under the Biden White House?
Well, there was no ground. I mean, it was all lost. We had no. There are three things that people have to understand. The first is, even at the height of the Cold War, even in the worst days of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had communication. And the reason why, if you want to be mature and grown-ups about it, I'm not a fan of most of what Vladimir Putin has done, and that's largely irrelevant when it comes to statecraft, because we ultimately have to be able to talk to a nation that has, in some cases, the largest tactical nuclear weapon stockpile in the world, and the second largest, if not the largest, strategic nuclear weapon stockpile in the world. So you have to have, I mean, at the end, whether we like it or not, Russia is a power, a global power, and they're involved and engaged in Syria. They've been involved and engaged in the Middle East, even in the Western Hemisphere, certainly in Europe. We have to have some communication with them. So step one is our embassy in Moscow is barely functioning. I mean, it literally barely operates because it's been denied access to the banking system. That has to be fixed. If we close our mission in Russia, we have to close their mission here. And then we really have no communication with them, whether it's a detained American or some other item. The second is, the president's been very clear. He wants this war with Ukraine to end. And he wants to know, are the Russians serious about ending the war or not serious about ending the war? The only way is to test them, to basically engage them and say, okay, are you serious about ending the war? And if so, what are your demands? Are your public demands and your private demands different? We have to have some process by which we engage in that conversation. Now, it may turn out that they don't want to end the war. I don't know. We're going to find out. But we have to have that process to determine that. And so our meeting was really a follow-up to President Trump's conversation with Putin. It's unfortunate that some of this hyperbole and some of this hysteria, because he talked to him on the phone, has clouded some of the rationale behind this. At the end of the day, we have to have relations with Russia, whether we like everything they're doing or not, because we did with the Soviet Union, and we have to be able to test and see if they're serious about ending this war.
In your meetings, did the Russian foreign minister make clear that there can be no end to the war if Ukraine joins NATO?
There was no discussions about any details. Now, the Russians have their own readout of what happened, but I can tell you we did not negotiate any fine points about any deal. The course of that conversation was as follows. Number one, we have to some level of regularization just of our diplomatic missions, because we have to be able to communicate with them, given the nature of our two countries and the importance that we have in the world. The second is, there are things we could cooperate on geopolitically, potentially. I mean, there are items of the world where I think we have a common interest. I'm not sure the Russians are fans of the Iranian regime having nuclear weapons, as an example, and so forth. But we can't work on those things. We're going to disagree on a lot, but we can't work on the things we might potentially agree on or deconflict on things that could lead to dangerous confrontations, as long as this Ukraine impediment stands in the way. And so really, as much as anything else, this meeting was, are you interested in even talking about ending the war? If you are, then let's create a process where we can begin to engage at a technical level. And that process will now, at some point, be set up and begin. I also think, by the way, it's unfair to say that we didn't consult anybody on it.
I was just going to ask you, Ukraine was not at the talks. Are you consulting with President Zelensky about his red lines?
Well, just in the last week, President Zelensky has met with the Secretary of the Treasury, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State, bipartisan delegations in the U.S. Senate and House that were also in Munich. Our special envoy is there today, meeting with him. So we talked to the Ukrainians throughout this process, and we explained to them very clearly what our intentions were in terms of pursuing this. In fact, the President of the United States spoke to Zelensky right after he hung up with Putin. I was in the office for both phone calls. So to say that we haven't consulted with them is not accurate. It's not true. It's also not true that we haven't consulted with our allies in Europe. I personally spoke to the 5 foreign ministers right after my meeting with the Russians and walked them through what had happened. We talked to them before those meetings, the same 5, plus the G7, plus the EU, and all the other meetings we had in Munich. So this is just not accurate. But that was a meeting to largely determine whether they were interested or not in finding a way to end this war.
Are they interested?
We're going to find out. I mean, I tell people peace is not it's an action. It's not a noun, it's a verb. It's an action. You have to actually pursue it. So at the end of the day, they're either interested or they're not. If the demands they make for ending the war are maximalist and unrealistic, then I think we have our answer. If, on the other hand, there's any opportunity to pursue peace, we have to do it. And I think people have, I really am sort of puzzled, generally, in diplomacy. People who are seeking to end the killing and the harming of thousands and thousands of people in war are usually celebrated for an effort to end the war. If it was just the Vatican who was involved in these talks, who would criticize it? For the President of the United States to be engaged in finding whether there's the possibility of peace should be celebrated, not condemned. But anyway, that's the kind of the world we live in right now.
Did the U.S. delegation make clear to the Russians that there are no guarantees about the retention of territory they have annexed from Ukraine?
We didn't engage in any specifics about territories, none of these, because that wasn't the purpose of that meeting. The purpose of the meeting was to determine whether there was a real interest in discussing peace or not. If there is, then a process like that can begin. And I also think it's silly to say, well, the Ukrainians are going to be cut out or the Europeans are going to be cut out. You can't find a stop to a war unless both of sides and their views are represented. They both have to agree to it. Like, Russia can't agree to a ceasefire or to an end of hostilities if the Ukrainians don't agree to it. It has to be on terms acceptable to both sides. Likewise with the Europeans. The Europeans and the EU have their own set of sanctions on Russia. Even if we lifted all of our sanctions, which none of that was discussed, the Europeans would have to lift sanctions too in order for something to be possible. So they'll all have to be consulted at some point, but we're just not at that stage yet.
So what's the signal, Secretary Rubio, that the Russians are serious about peace?
Well, the signal, I can't answer whether they're serious about peace or not yet. That will have to be determined by the attitude they take moving forward. The only thing we agreed upon is that we're going to talk about peace. What they offer, what they're willing to concede to, what they're willing to consider, will determine whether they're serious about peace or not. We're just not at that stage yet.
When President Trump posted that President Zelensky is a dictator without elections, what are you thinking?
I think President Trump is very upset at President Zelensky, and in some cases, and rightfully so. Look, number one, Joe Biden had frustrations with Zelensky. People shouldn't forget it. There are newspaper articles out there about how he cursed at him in a phone call because Zelensky, instead of saying thank you for all your help, is immediately out there messaging what we're not doing or what he's not getting. I think the second thing is, frankly, I was personally very upset because we had a conversation with President Zelensky, the Vice President and I, the three of us. And we discussed this issue about the mineral rights. And we explained to them, look, we want to be in a joint venture with you, not because we're trying to steal from your country, but because we think that's actually a security guarantee. If we're your partner in an important economic endeavor, we get to get paid back some of the money the taxpayers have given, close to $200 billion. And it also, now we have a vested interest in the security of Ukraine. And he said, sure, we want to do this deal. It makes all the sense in the world. The only thing is I need to run it through my legislative process. They have to approve it. I read 2 days later that Zelensky's out there saying, I rejected the deal. I told him, no way, that we're not doing that. Well, that's not what happened in that meeting. So you start to get upset by somebody. We're trying to help these guys. One of the points the president made in his messaging is not that we don't care about Ukraine, but Ukraine is on another continent. You know, it doesn't directly impact the daily lives of Americans. We care about it because it has implications for our allies and ultimately for the world. There should be some level of gratitude here about this. And when you don't see it and you see him out there accusing the president of living in a world of disinformation, that's very counterproductive. And I don't need to explain to you or anybody else. President Trump's not the kind of person that's going to sit there and take that. He's very transparent. He's going to tell you exactly how he feels. And he sent a message that he's not going to get gamed here. He's willing to work on peace because he cares about Ukraine. And he hopes Zelensky will be a partner in that and not someone who's out there putting this sort of counter messaging to try to, hustle us in that regard. That's not going to be productive here.
What's the timeline for a meeting between President Trump and President Putin?
Well, that topic came up in our conversation with